I didn't know much about the new family moving into the house across the street when the moving trucks arrived one sunny morning. It was the Johnsons, a husband and wife in their early 40s, with 2 kids around 8 and 10. At first glance, they looked like any other suburban family trying to start fresh. But in our small neighborhood, people talk, and it didn't take long for the whispers to spread. "They're not the friendliest sort," Mrs. Turner from next door said to me while we watered our lawns. "You'll see." I didn't press her for details, but it soon became clear she wasn't just being dramatic. Within days, they made their presence felt. Mr. Johnson complained about the Sanchez kids playing soccer in the street, their loud laughter cutting through the air. When Mr. Patel walked his dog past their yard, Mrs. Johnson muttered loudly enough for him to hear, "Don't they have their own streets to walk on?" I'd catch glimpses of them outside, their faces drawn tight with disapproval whenever someone who didn't look like them passed by. Their words weren't always direct, but the way they'd look at people, the muttered comments and the cold politeness spoke volumes. But the house? They couldn't have known about the house. The house had a reputation. It was old, easily the oldest on the block, with ivy that seemed to creep higher every year and windows that looked like tired eyes. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was just a sad place, steeped in the stories of those who had lived there before. But I'd never thought much about it. It was just another house, until the Johnsons moved in. From the moment they crossed the threshold, the house seemed to stir. It started small. Mrs. Johnson swore she heard voices in the walls late at night, faint whispers that faded when she leaned closer. "You're imagining things," Mr. Johnson said, his irritation barely hidden. But then the lights began to flicker, and no electrician could find the cause. The kids started complaining next. Their toys wouldn't stay where they left them, and the closet doors would creak open on their own. "It's just the wind," Mr. Johnson said, though his voice grew tighter each time he said it. One night, the family portrait they'd hung above the fireplace was found lying face down on the floor. "It's an old house," Mrs. Johnson muttered, her voice shaking as she picked it up. "Things settle." But deep down, they knew something wasn't right. It wasn't long before the strange happenings escalated. Late one night, I saw Mrs. Johnson run out onto their porch, her face pale as a sheet. She was clutching a blanket around her shoulders, shivering, even though the summer air was warm. "I can't stay in there," she cried to her husband, who followed her out, his face flushed with anger. "What did you see?" he demanded, though his voice betrayed his own fear. "Shadows," she whispered, her hands trembling. They were in the hallway. They moved, even though no one was there. "Don't start," he snapped, dragging her back inside. But even from my porch, I could see the way his hand shook as he gripped her arm. After that, the Johnsons became reclusive. The family who once stood on their driveway muttering about the wrong sort of people now kept their curtains drawn tight and their doors locked. The kids stopped playing in the yard, and even the dog seemed reluctant to go outside. Rumors spread quickly in a neighborhood like ours. "They say the house is haunted," Mrs. Turner told me one afternoon. She'd been talking to Mrs. Johnson on the rare occasion she ventured outside. "Apparently it's filled with the spirits of people who were wronged there. The house forces anyone inside to relive the pain they caused." I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but something about her words lingered. That night, I watched from my window as shadows flickered behind the Johnsons' curtains, moving in unnatural patterns. The next morning, faint cries echoed across the street, so faint I couldn't be sure I wasn't imagining them. The Johnsons didn't come out for days. Then came the night the house made its intentions clear. It started with laughter, soft at first, like children playing in another room. But as the night deepened, the laughter turned hollow and cruel, echoing through the house until it reached every corner. The family huddled together in the living room, but there was no escape. The walls began to change. The peeling wallpaper revealed something beneath it. Faces, dozens of them, etched into the wood. Their expressions were twisted in pain, their eyes wide with desperation. Mrs. Johnson screamed as the faces seemed to turn toward her, their mouths moving in silent accusation. Mr. Johnson tried to open the front door, but it wouldn't budge. "Let us out!" he shouted, pounding on the door until his fists were raw. But the house wasn't done with them. Each member of the family was separated, forced to confront their own guilt. Mr. Johnson found himself in the study, the door slamming shut behind him. The walls came alive, displaying scenes from his past. Every racist comment he'd made, every look of disdain, every act of cruelty. The whispers grew louder, repeating his words back to him. "You don't belong here. Go back to where you came from." He tried to shut his eyes, but the voices wouldn't stop. "Do you feel it?" they asked. "Do you feel the pain you caused?" Mrs. Johnson was trapped in the hallway, now stretching endlessly before her. She heard the voices of people she'd dismissed and mocked, their words filled with pain she had never cared to understand. Her reflection stared back at her from a cracked mirror on the wall. Not the woman she thought she was, but someone cold and cruel, a stranger to herself. The children were confronted with words they didn't yet understand, scrawled in bold letters across their bedroom walls. "Hate is taught. Learn to love." Their toys moved on their own, forming patterns they couldn't decipher, but they felt the heaviness of it, the weight of their family's actions. By morning, the family was broken. They sat in the living room, their faces pale and tear-streaked, clutching each other as the house fell silent. "We're sorry," Mrs. Johnson whispered into the stillness. "We see it now. We see what we've done. Please let us go." One by one, they begged for forgiveness, not just from the house, but from the people they'd wronged. They promised to change, their voices raw with desperation. The house seemed to listen. The air grew lighter, and the oppressive weight lifted. The front door creaked open. The Johnsons left that day. They didn't say goodbye, didn't explain their sudden departure, but the neighborhood noticed the difference. Before they left, Mr. Johnson approached Mr. Patel with an apology. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice heavy with shame. "I'm sorry." The house, now empty again, stood quietly on the corner. Its windows no longer seemed to watch, but its presence lingered. I still pass it sometimes and wonder, was it haunted by spirits or by the truth? Whatever it was, it changed the Johnsons. Maybe it will change the next family too. The house waits. It always waits.